you have to realize is that personal trainers obviously take on many roles. One of the roles that we may take on, of course, apart from working in gyms and running boot camps and things like that, is you might be working one-on-one with clients at their homes. In that situation, you might have an opportunity to have a little peek in their fridge and in their pantry and see what type of food they have. Then you can ask them questions on how they prepare it, and you can even actually ask them to prepare their food, so you can actually see the way that they actually prepare the meals in terms of, you know, the fat content and preservatives that they may use, salt and soy sauce and things like that. So that gives you an opportunity to give them some advice, you know, which is fantastic. But a lot of the content of Section 2, especially with this particular NDS, relates to personal trainers in a very different scenario than you're probably familiar with. Some personal trainers work in community settings, such as aged care facilities. So you'd be designing exercise programs individually, specifically for elderly clients. Also, you may be working in a child daycare center and you're designing exercise programs for those type of individuals. So the community-based settings, so people are there for the whole day, or some people may be even living there. So with your Diploma of Nutrition and Dietetics on top of your personal training qualification, what you may become involved with is you may actually be the go-between or the liaison between the dietitian and nutritionist and the individual clients. So with that role, it's really important, obviously, to be able to understand what the dietitian is actually prescribing. And it's also important to liaise with the clients and be aware of clients' individuality in terms of their food preferences. So it's a really important liaising role. So as I said, a lot of this first webinar really talks about a community-based type of role. So with that being said, let's move on to the first slide. If I can do that. Let's have a little click there. There we go. All right, so assisting clients with meal selections. This is, again, kind of assuming that a client is working with a dietitian. And if they are working with a dietitian, obviously it's really important to record and act on the client food preferences, because it enhances the acceptance of the nutrition plan that's been designed by the dietitian. Dietitians, obviously their role is to design the most appropriate plan for their client, but there are certain parameters that can be varied within that, and a lot of it relates to food preferences. So finding food preferences that your client really likes obviously enhances the palatability and the likely adherence to the program designed by the dietitian. So it really has to factor in things like ethnicity, personal beliefs such as religious beliefs or ethical or moral beliefs, cooking simplicity for people who really struggle either with vision or with injuries and things like that. And some people are just really not interested in preparing food, so you've got to keep it as simple as you possibly can. And obviously catering to the individual tastes. The plan really should be as simple as possible, and it's really important that when you have actually implemented this plan that you do record down, because remember the plan has been designed by the dietitian, so it's important that you do record down everything that's actually implemented. In other words, what the client has actually eaten in terms of quality, quantity, portion sizes, and variations from a theme, really. Also, when you're taking on a new personal training client or a new client in terms of providing nutritional advice, it's really important that you record down all of the basic information like personal information, family and medical history, obviously information about their diet history, profiles, diet cards, diet outlines, and it's really important that you update any changes, any recommended changes to the diet plan that are recommended by the dietitian. So you have this constant ability to give feedback to the client and also to give feedback to the dietitian. Right, So, providing the client with guidance. Remember, as a personal trainer and also with your diploma in nutrition and dietetics, you are largely going to be an educator. Clients have varied degrees of understanding, nutritional status requirements that they personally have, and any potential interactions with drugs. Now, this is a really interesting point in terms of interactions with drugs, because there are certain foods that do have quite serious interactions with drugs. For example, if your client is recommended to eat citrus fruits, for example, your oranges and your lemons, and that's specifically recommended by the dietitian. If they don't particularly like those, and you in your wisdom say, well, grapefruit is a citrus fruit, let me replace the oranges and the lemons with grapefruit. The unfortunate thing with grapefruit is that it has an enzyme in it that reacts or interacts with a large number of drugs. So it's actually not allowed to be consumed, often within a 4-hour window of taking those particular drugs. Now, you won't necessarily know this, but the dietitian will know this. So if you're changing anything in relation to your diet plan, you always need to consult with the dietitian, because that's why they do a 4-year degree, to give them that base level of knowledge. So really what you're going to be doing as well is providing assistance with basic understanding of nutrients. So your macronutrients, your micronutrients, but also cooking methods, whether you're deep frying versus baking, and the amount of fat or the amount of calories are going to be involved in those. Different textures of food, raw food obviously versus pureed food, and also the digestibility. And again, you'll learn more about digestibility as we go through this course. Protein sources, many different types of protein sources, many different types of carbohydrate sources. Being aware of the GI, in other words, the glycemic index of those carbohydrate sources, is actually important, so that you can design it in relation to the client's needs. Vegetarian options, obviously some clients may be vegetarian, so just being aware of what vegetarians are allowed to eat, and the difference obviously between a vegetarian and a vegan. Sometimes you'll be assisting in weight loss by reducing sugary desserts, for example, or factoring or being aware of the fact that fruit juice actually has about the same number of calories as Coca-Cola. So it's got about 200 to 250 calories in a 250 milliliter glass. So a lot of your clients will think, well, fruit juice is actually very healthy. Well, it is in terms of the micronutrients, but it also has a lot of calories. And if your client's on a weight loss program, then suggesting water rather than fruit juice would be a logical option. One of the important things to realize is that there are cultural aspects that really come into the appropriateness of meals. So, but not just cultural, also religious aspects, social aspects, ethical and moral aspects, and obviously also health factors that can really have a significant impact on food choices. Social interactions at meals are other things to consider. Some people, when they're interacting with other individuals, they consume greater quantities, especially at nighttime when they may be consuming alcohol. So if people do eat out a lot, that is going to really impact on their total calorie intake throughout the day. Whereas other people, when they're very, very social, they tend to eat more slowly, and then they tend to eat less, especially at lunchtime. If they're having like a business meeting, they tend to snack on foods. So again, you need to make it specific to the individual client. Vegetarians, as we mentioned earlier, generally exclude meat, but sometimes they accept eggs and sometimes they accept dairy. Depends on whether they're pesco-vegetarian or ovo-vegetarian. Vegans really exclude all animal products, so anything that's made with animal products, and generally they don't use anything that's derived, any clothing that's derived from animal products as well. Also being aware that indigenous Aboriginal populations are sometimes susceptible to chronic diseases, because in rural communities, a lot of the quality of the food that's grown out there is actually subpar in terms of its micronutrient quality, and therefore that can lead to some chronic diseases. Also culturally, there are differences in Macronutrient preferences. So, for example, with carbohydrates, some cultures are potato dominant, some are bread dominant, others like the grain cereals and rice, but other communities would favor things like millet and taro. And if they're not really grain or agriculturally based, they might use breadfruits, for example, and bananas as their main sources of carbohydrates. Your fat sources can include fish, pork, and if you're a vegetarian, it can come from coconut, palm, peanut oils. And again, it's important to know the saturated fat content versus the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat content of these fat sources. Protein sources can include obviously your meats, your fish, your legumes, and if you're a vegetarian, your nuts, your milks, your yogurts, and obviously various herbs and spices can add a lot of flavor, and these can actually be used to replace, for example, fats and sugars to enhance the palatability while you're actually trying to reduce the fat or carbohydrate or sugar content of certain meals. So again, in terms of assisting clients with meal selection, some clients will actually need a fair amount of assistance because they have physical conditions that may limit their ability to either prepare food or to actually eat food or digest food. People with failing eyesight really struggle to prepare food. I mentioned that earlier. People with RA, which is rheumatoid arthritis in their dominant hand, it's actually painful to prepare food. So they will sometimes actually be nutritionally devoid because they just don't spend a lot of time preparing food. People with headaches, people who are feeling unwell, or people with mouth or stomach ulcers actually makes the process of consuming food quite uncomfortable. Some people struggle with urination and they struggle with bowel problems, and again, that can affect the type of food that they eat, but also the quantity of liquid that they may want to consume because they want to minimize the amount of urination. So injuries to the dominant hand or eyes obviously can affect it, but also in terms of apprehension. If a menu plan is too complex, then clients can become very apprehensive because they may have only cooked very, very simple meals, so that may prevent them from following the meal plan because simply they're apprehensive about the complexity of the meal. Disinterest in food, as we mentioned, some medical side effects. Some people experience nausea and sleepiness, so that can actually impact their interest in food. Some people will actually feel slightly embarrassed because they're unable to feed themselves. Or they're unable to read the menu that's actually designed for them. So they tend to follow their own program because they're embarrassed that their eyesight's bad or they can't read English. That might be another example. People can obviously be forgetful, especially as we get older. Our memory and our cognition starts to fail. So people will often forget to follow certain menu plans. Cultural factors as well there, language or reading difficulties. If you can get the meal plan translated into the language of the individual, obviously that is going to be your ideal scenario. Another area that we need to discuss is providing feedback on poor meal choices. As it states at the top, the client may ignore advice and continue to make poor meal choices, but they're not able to understand how these choices actually impact on their health, or they completely ignore the advice that's given. And again, this ties in with your role as an educator. So data collection is actually really important, so you can record the portion sizes, etc. So the quality of the food, the quantity of the food, portion sizes, number of grams, etc. Then when you're recording this, you can actually compare their actual intake with what's recommended in the dietary plan. And obviously you can note any discrepancies that occur, and you can feed this back to the client, but you can also feed it back to the dietitian. The dietitian obviously might want to get involved if this is quite a significant discrepancy. So it is really important that we do keep good records. Clients sometimes are unaware that they have a particular pattern. For example, some clients often omit breakfast, and it's not something that's really on their radar. Or some clients, weight loss clients, often, like every night, they might have a 3-course meal, always finishing with dessert. So they're unaware of particular patterns, and sometimes breaking patterns are really, really important. So behavior modification is really going to be largely one of the roles that you're going to be involved with. Another area of feedback is in relation to hydration status. If a client does get dehydrated, that can impact on their metabolism. It can obviously lead to skin aging. It can reduce their mental focus. It can lead to generalized feelings of fatigue, and it can lead to constipation. So again, it's really important to record down the volume of liquid that they're consuming, the type of liquid that they're consuming, and the timing of the liquid. So you probably know that the general recommendations are 8 cups a day, but is that 8 teacups or is that 8 tall glasses? Well, it is in fact 8 tall glasses. Typically it's about a 250 milliliter glass, so 8 of those in a day is actually going to be about 2 liters of water. That's what's generally recommended for most clients. Obviously athletic people will need to consume more. Younger clients in certain situations, because maybe they're in a child daycare center, they're away from home, they don't have their parents making sure that they do drink the juices or the cordials or their water on a daily basis, they may feel a little bit uncomfortable or anxious in that surroundings, so maybe their hydration status is not ideal. Older clients, especially older and infirm clients, or clients, especially male clients with prostate enlargement. The prostate gland, unfortunately, when it enlarges, presses on the bladder, so the bladder gets to a certain size and actually it wants to empty. So clients with prostate enlargement, and also clients with weak pelvic floor muscles or weak ureter sphincter muscles, and as we get older, all of these muscles tend to weaken. They often don't want to consume the required amount of liquid because they frequently need to go to the toilet. So especially in the aged care facilities, they often have what's called an indwelling catheter, which goes directly into the bladder, and it's connected to a bag that sits outside of their body. So in that case, it is really important that they do maintain their hydration status. Clients of any age may experience drug side effects, pain, listlessness, or may have difficulty swallowing, especially thin liquids. Clients drinking pure water may find it quite difficult to actually swallow the water. They may experience a condition called dysphagia, which literally means difficulty in swallowing. And if you can thicken the liquid up by pureeing vegetables with it or adding pulp into fruit juices, then that actually makes it sometimes more easier to actually swallow. So, moving down to infection control policies and procedures, there's lots of information in section 2 of your online notes on these particular policies and procedures, and we're not going to go through all of those because you can really read a lot of those in that particular section. But what we'll do is we'll overview some of the procedure. We're not going to go through this in a lot of detail. There are lots of pictures on the next few slides. It is really important, though, that you do scrub all areas. So again, using soap or an alcohol-based type of detergent. You've got to wash the palms, you've got to wash the backs, you've got to wash in between the fingers, around the thumbs. Everything needs to be covered, basically. And then, obviously, when you rinse, you need to rinse for at least 10 seconds. And very importantly, you do need to dry thoroughly. With a single-use towel, you can use an air dryer, but single-use towels are generally preferable. And then use the towel to actually turn the tap off so you don't pick up any bacteria off the tap. So what we have on the next slide is literally all the steps from wetting your hands with water all the way down to your hands are now safe. So there are 11 steps, so when you're doing your video, you just need to make sure that you follow all those steps. They're fairly descriptive, and you've got the nice pictures that you can follow for your guideline. So the duration of the hand washing, it says 15 to 20 seconds, total duration, including the initial wetting and the hand drying, takes about 40 to 60 seconds. Right, the food safety program. A very important component. And we're really talking about the preparation, storage, transportation, and handling of food. So again, sometimes in one of these community-based facilities, you might be involved in food preparation yourself, or again, you might be the liaison between the dietitian and the cooks who are actually preparing the food. So again, having steps in place in terms of food safety program is actually very important. So if you are a personal trainer or a healthcare worker, the areas that you're really going to be involved with in terms of the food safety program are preparing the nutrition support services, storage of food, and of course your own personal hygiene when you're actually handling food. So a couple of different areas that you'll be involved with. Stock control, we often talk about the expression first in, first out. So if you're getting new stock in, that needs to go out first. So just being aware of the fact that some foods obviously are very perishable. So keeping them in the ideal temperature is very important, and only using fresh foods, and really making sure that no foods go beyond their expiry date. Protective clothing, we often call it PPE, or protective personal equipment, things like gloves, covers for your hair, protective overalls. Sometimes people even wear covers of their shoes. Sometimes it's maybe just tying your hair back so that your hair doesn't actually fall in, or strands of hair don't actually fall into the food that's being prepared. Very important. Sanitation of surfaces, utensils and equipment obviously should use appropriate chemicals in the correct amount of dilution. So being aware of what chemicals should be used and the right dilution status for those chemicals. And being aware that toxic ingredients, for example, in those cleansers, which often have a very alkaline or very caustic base, or even fly sprays, because obviously you don't want insects flying around in food preparation areas, those toxic ingredients should be stored completely separately in a separate cupboard from any food, obviously in case they leak, because they do have very toxic ingredients in them. If you do have an open flame, it's important that there is an extinguisher to be on the premises. Checking equipment, that should say for wear and tear, not war and tear, as a crack seal, especially in rubber seals, obviously can harbor bacteria. The food safety program for unusual events, for example, if there's a power outage and you can't use your blender, for example, then thinking about ways that you can think outside the box. So having a hand blender obviously would be appropriate. It would take a little bit longer, but it's one way of still being able to prepare food when there's actually no power in your facility. Water quality, very important. In towns, it's very much monitored by external authorities, but in rural areas, there may be poor water quality, so you may need to implement a system to purify the water. So obviously that's very important, not just for cleaning the food, but obviously for cooking the food as well. Right, so again, assessment activity 7, which some of you may have done. There's 3 questions in here, and they all relate to the food safety program. We pretty well covered those points on the previous slide, but again, suitability of products, looking at the use by date and the correct type of product that you're actually using, secure and safe storage conditions, specific hygiene protocols for cleanliness of the preparation site, not just the preparation services, but obviously the utensils, and making sure that when you dispose of rubbish, it goes into a rubbish bin that has a sealable lid. Personal hygiene requirements, we cover those to a certain degree. The timeliness of preparation, it's really important that prepared food is not left out on a surface, because there is going to be bacteria somewhere in the air. The longer it gets exposed to that air, the more likelihood there will be of bacteria to actually get in there. Timeliness of separate storage for toxic compounds, already mentioned that. Safety indications for unusual events, we already mentioned that in terms of the power outage. But if there's a fairly long power outage, a period of hours, it's important to know that a fridge, a well-sealed fridge, can actually keep food in a cool enough environment for approximately 4 hours. A deep freeze, again, if it's very well sealed, can keep food frozen for up to 2 days, as long as it's not constantly being opened. So being aware of things like that is important when you're obviously holding and preparing food. Food preparations appropriate to the instructions of the dietitian. So there will be some clients who suffer from weight loss, dehydration, dysphagia, which was again that difficulty of swallowing, and they obviously do need special attention. So we already mentioned dysphagia. Thickening liquids does add that quality to food, which actually encourages that peristalsis, or that swallowing motion. It's a lot easier than it is done with thin liquids. Assisting hydration, obviously getting the optimal amount of fluid intake. So that's not just in terms of drinking water, but also in terms of soups and fruit juices, teas and coffees. But you might be aware that especially highly caffeinated drinks do actually have a diuretic quality. So caffeinated drinks such as coffee, fair amount of caffeine in that, more than black tea and definitely more than green tea. So you need to look at, if they do drink a lot of those types of drinks, then they do have a partial dehydrating effect or diuretic effect. So they need to add more water into their daily intake. Energy or protein oral supplements. So again, being aware that there are certain brands. Ensure is a very common one, which is designed, was originally designed for children. They also have ones for older populations. And again, the palatability of these, either the brand-based palatability or the vanilla, strawberry, chocolate palatability. Some clients may prefer one over another. So again, that could be one of your roles in selecting specific protein supplements for them. Increasing meal frequency, again, changing the temperature or changing the taste or changing the texture of food can actually change the palatability of the food. So it's really important to change it up just to make sure that your clients do get the optimal amount of nutrition. Enteral formula is formula which is actually provided through a gastrointestinal tube. Now, the only people who would actually administer this would be nurses in the facility or dietitians. It's not going to be something that you'll be involved with unless you are actually a nurse yourself, but some dietitians do actually need to provide the gastrointestinal tube to provide what's called an enteral formula. So you just need to make sure that the guidelines set by the dietitian are actually followed and recorded in this particular case. So sometimes in this food safety program, with the practices and the processes, errors do actually occur. Sometimes they're human errors, sometimes they're equipment errors, and sometimes it's just because procedures get changed and the procedures are not followed in the most compliant way. So it's really important you can identify and report practices not complying with the food safety program. And who would you report it to? Well, in certain cases, you might report directly back to the nutritionist or the dietitian. Or if there is a supervisor or a manager within your facility, then you need to report the corrective action to this person, or the fact that something's gone wrong at some stage within the procedures of the food safety program. So immediate reporting to a designated position or person in that position within the organization. The position might vary depending on the circumstances or the type of facility that you're actually working in. Taking control of the situation, and again, that should say with your own level of responsibility. So there are certain things that you can take responsibility for, but it's really important that if you do that, that you do follow up, that you record it, and you follow up with the person in a senior position so that they know that you've taken the specific actions for that procedure. Organization may provide alternative procedures in certain circumstances. For example, when there's that sustained loss of power, obviously getting generators involved, and just making sure that the fridge is kept closed during long power outages. If you're working in one of those facilities, your own personal training and employment contract or conditions will really indicate your own personal area of responsibility. If you're unsure of your own level of responsibility in any situation, obviously it's really important that you do ask the supervisor or the manager. Nutrition support information. This is actually the last slide that we're going to go through. Nutrition information, obviously, the dietitian will provide most of the information. They will be designing the meal plan, but it will be one of your responsibilities to provide possibly pamphlets or searching on the internet for some additional information that might be relevant to your particular client. So nutrition information, best cooking techniques, and recommended recipes. Dietary information to support nutrition for a specific illness. Again, the dietitian or the nurse or the doctor definitely has to get involved in that, but you can certainly get some information from the internet to provide supportive information for your client. Nutritionally most appropriate ready-to-eat meals from supermarkets and takeaways, and again this will be for clients that you may be working with one-on-one, because there are some reasonably good quality takeaway outlets and takeaway meals, but there are some really bad ones, as you will be aware of. Quick and easy ideas to improve nutritional density of ready-to-eat meals. For example, if you're cooking baked beans, one way of adding a little bit of protein to that would be grating some cheese on it. It adds a little bit of fat, but it also adds some protein to your baked beans. Nutritional shakes or high-protein energy snakes, just being aware of what's available on the market so you can actually recommend these things to your clients. Consider likes and dislikes of clients, obviously very, very important, and providing nutritional information for the family sometimes to assist the clients with meal suggestions, especially for clients who really struggle to prepare meals for themselves.